Happy Friday, magic lovers. It's Tracy Partridge-Johnson back with another reading from my book, The Golden Telescope, book 1 in my Jack and the Magic Hatmaker middle grade fantasy fiction series. Before I start reading, I would like to take a moment to invite you to go ahead and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that yet. And also ring that bell so that you receive notifications every time I upload new content, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I think starting on Sunday too, I'm going to just start having like a weekly chit chat about being a self-published author and some of the other things that I've got going on in my life. So if you have thought about publishing your own book or your own story, or starting a YouTube channel, or just have an interest in learning about publishing or fiction in general, then feel free to tune in to those on Sundays. I don't know if I'm going to go live doing those or not, but I will certainly start doing that once a week on Sundays. So it won't be reading from my books, but it will be just kind of chit chat talking about my experience with becoming a self-published author. So that said, let's go ahead and dive in where we left off last time. This is going to be chapter 5. We'll see how many chapters I read in today's episode. Chapter 5, The Telescope. Portland, Oregon, present day. The world was slowly coming into focus, and though his heart was pounding and his breathing ragged, Jack was aware of Bart going frantically through his pockets and instinctively knew what he was searching for. Continuing to draw in raspy lungfuls of air, he swatted his friend's hand away, reaching deep into his jacket pocket for his inhaler. He exhaled as far as he could and shoved it into his mouth. With a dramatic inhale, the medicated mist shot down his lungs, and gradually his breathing slowed, and he was able to calm himself. Pushing himself up into a seated position and supporting his weight with his hands, Jack looked accusingly at his friend, who, judging by his wild-eyed stare, was just as shaken by the episode as Jack was. "What in the freak is that thing?" "What do you mean?" Bart asked indignantly from where he knelt on the floor. His voice was squeaky and a little louder than usual. But seeing that his friend was now recovering, his shoulders relaxed a bit. Reaching up, he removed his cap and brushed the hair off of his forehead where it had plastered itself to him with sweat. Wiping his hand on his pants leg, he slumped down onto his butt, blinking aggressively and shaking his head back and forth in dismay. Feeling a sudden weakness as the adrenaline wore off, Jack leaned back against the wall. He stared up at the ceiling, feeling his best friend's eyes on him. "What just happened to you? It was like you had some kind of seizure or something. Do I need to call 911? Jack rolled his eyes. "No, it wasn't me, dummy. It was that freaking telescope." He looked down at it lying on the ground a few feet from where they were sitting. "Keep that thing away from me," he said, scooting a little further away from it for emphasis. "What do you mean it was the telescope?" Bart asked. "Nothing happened to me when I held it, so it can't be the telescope. I mean, you saw me holding it. I handed it to you, remember?" He looked at the floor, hesitating, before he continued. "I hate to ask this, but could your asthma be getting worse, Jack? Is it possible that you're just starting to have seizures now, too?" Jack met Bart's eyes, and irritation flared in him instantly. This was not about a medical condition. Jack was sure of that. Or at least, he was pretty sure. Rubbing his eyes and gazing absently down at the floor next to his legs, Jack started to think. Was it possible that his body spontaneously had some kind of attack, making him hallucinate the images and experience he had just been through? Oh man, he groaned inwardly. He hadn't considered that, but Bart might have a point. After all, his asthma attacks had been happening with increased frequency lately, and then there was the new tingling sensation in his hands. Maybe he was right. He shook his head and sighed. As scary as it is for me to say this, you might be right. Jack looked at Bart, his heart starting to race again. I hadn't told you this before now because it hadn't occurred to me, but I've actually been having more asthma attacks lately. They've been getting more intense, and there's something else that's new that I don't understand. He paused, gauging Bart's expression before moving on. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and my hands are tingling intensely. Not like I've been lying on them or anything like that. Like they just start burning really bad. He looked down at his hands and rubbed them together, struggling to comprehend how his body could go from feeling so out of whack to so normal. Sheesh, what in the world, Bart? Am I starting to have seizures? I mean, that's pretty much the only rational explanation, right? Dude, I have no idea, Bart replied. But maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea for you to get checked out by a doc, at least. He twisted his mouth into an odd expression, clearly uncomfortable, presenting the idea. Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, if this keeps getting worse, who knows where I'll end up? Jack subconsciously clenched his hands into fists. The thought of being at the mercy of his condition freaked him out. But as always, he swallowed his fear and resorted to reason and logic. The doctors would figure out what was wrong with him. He would be okay. I mean, it totally sucks, Bart said. But what just happened to you right there? That really tripped me out. Dude. Who knows when or where you could be next time it happens? You're lucky you weren't alone. You could have gotten hit by a car or something. He reached over to pick up the telescope, looking at it curiously, then stood up and carefully placed it back on the desk. It's just so strange, though, Jack started, as he pushed himself off the floor. I don't understand where those images came from. It's not like anything I've ever seen or experienced before. He grabbed his backpack, which was leaning up against the door, and tossed it over his left shoulder. Well, the brain is a mysterious thing. Who knows where it pulls junk from? Bart said. What images are you talking about, anyway? The experience I just had? That seizure? It seemed like it was related to the telescope. I mean, it's almost like I was transported onto the deck of a ship back in the olden days. I could literally see and smell the ocean, feel the movement underneath my feet as the ship rocked and with the waves. He followed Bart back into the storeroom, closing the office door behind him as he continued. But the weird thing was, it wasn't me. Bart stopped ahead of Jack, turning just before pulling back the curtain to the shop floor. He watched Jack carefully, a soft frown creasing his forehead. What do you mean? Jack shrugged. It was like I was looking out of someone else's eyes. I remember looking down at my hands, but they weren't my hands. They were grown-up hands with hair and a big ring on one of the fingers. And Jack looked down at his hands as he spoke, reimagining the scene in his mind, thinking through all the details now for the first time since the incident occurred. I was holding that telescope. The telescope was in the vision I was having. Doesn't that seem a little weird? Well, yeah, I guess it does seem pretty crazy. But then again, the brain. You just saw the telescope before it happened, so maybe your brain just picked out the first thing it remembered and threw that into whatever you saw. He paused, deep in thought. Either way, I still think it would be a good idea for you to get checked out. I agree with you. Jack sighed. He didn't know what he was trying to convince himself of anyway. Never mind, he said. I think I better skip school and call Aunt Lizzie, just in case. Oh, there's one thing I didn't mention yet, Jack added, following Bart through the store toward the front door. The sunlight glaring through the glass felt too bright for being in the dim-lit office for so long. What's that? Bart asked, pulling the door open so Jack could step through and onto the sidewalk. There was this beautiful woman on the ship. She was standing on the deck with me. Bart snorted. Forget a doctor. I think we need to find you a girlfriend. Jack rolled his eyes, but smirked, pulling out his phone to call Aunt Lizzie. Chapter 6. The Dark Cabal. Stockholm, Sweden, present day. Inez McPayden was gazing out a large, leaded glass window onto a vast and frigid landscape, the last remaining glimmer of daylight rapidly diminishing over the horizon. Though it was only 4:15 in the afternoon, you would have expected it to be much later in the day. But in this remote corner of the world, the moon ruled many more months of the year than the sun did. Darkness was the norm rather than the exception. Thin and gaunt, with skin the color of cooked oats, and dark hair pulled back tightly into a knot on the top of her head, Inez rarely cracked a smile. She was not a happy person by nature. Wearing a slate gray, high-neck dress with stiff little ruffles that touched her chin, her demeanor was cool, removed, and unforgiving. Time is running out, Dreadfort. There is no denying it. Sadie will be coming into her powers soon, and action must be taken to assure her devotion well before that happens. She turned around slowly to face the others in the room. There were 6 of them, all seated around an enormous ebony table. Phineas Dreadfort, Earl O'Brien, Genevieve Whisperstill, Thaddeus O'Brien, Desmond Radcliffe, and her younger sister, Clara McPayden. I've observed no indication whatsoever that Sadie's abilities have begun to show themselves, Genevieve said, gazing down longingly at the cloudy rose quartz and gold ring she wore on her right hand ring finger. But she is nearing her 11th birthday, so I agree, time is short. She casually set down her fork and wiped her mouth with a white cloth napkin. Then, raising a crystal goblet half full of red wine, she took a sip before continuing on. She and I have built a meaningful bond these past 9 years, and I believe she truly thinks of me as her mother. Well done, Jen, Clara smiled. Her wild mass of pumpkin-colored hair stood out in sharp contrast against her porcelain skin and vibrant green eyes. That bond will be required in order to achieve our objectives. Strolling toward them and seating herself at the head of the table, Inez once again took control of the discussion. Is there a problem with Ethan, Thaddeus? I was under the impression things were progressing splendidly between the two of you. Thaddeus O'Brien cowered slightly under Inez's cold, hard stare. No, there's no problem. It was not my intention to cause undue concern. He reached up to twist the ends of his closely cropped black beard between his fingers. The nearly identical ring on his right hand was glowing a brilliant sapphire blue. It's just that, well, Ethan can be very demanding. Especially so now that he is getting better acquainted with his powers. His confidence and, dare I say, arrogant tendencies are increasing substantially, which means it is becoming more of a challenge, shall we say, to manage him. My only fear is that he may want to go rogue at some point, and that could be disastrous for all of us. O'Brien, in an effort to avert Inez's gaze, now looked down at the partially eaten plate of food in front of him. Picking up a knife and fork, he very deliberately sliced a piece of meat, put it into his mouth, and began to chew. Yes, disastrous indeed. Inez raised her left eyebrow with disdain, her deep-set eyes drilling an imaginary hole right through the man's bowed forehead. She detested any sign of weakness, especially in men. It's your job, Thaddeus, to ensure that does not happen. You, she emphasized, are the adult in this situation. Use whatever means necessary to bring the boy into full compliance with our plans. Otherwise, well... And without shifting her gaze, she lifted the steak knife from the table in front of her and sank the tip of it deftly into the beef on her plate, twisting so that the bloody juices oozed out, pooling on her plate. The consequences could be dire. Her eyes glazed across each face around the table. This was not a warning meant for only one. And what of Jack, Earl? Have you any news to report on him? She shifted her gaze and was now looking intently in his direction. Earl O'Brien, a big man with a paunch belly and striped bow tie, was the financial expert of the group. He was mostly bald, and what was left of his salt and pepper hair graced the sides and back of his larger-than-normal head like a pair of oversized earmuffs. He wore little, round, wire-rimmed glasses perched down close to the end of his nose, and they framed his dull-looking gray eyes in a way that said, "No nonsense allowed." Nothing much to report about Jack. He appears to be the same boring, nerdy kid he's always been. Keeps to himself mostly, working numbers on his phone. Though, he did mention the other night that he has been having some sleep disturbances lately, and we have noticed his voice is beginning to crack, which I know can be an indicator, so I'm keeping an eye on that. He sat back in his chair, eyeing Inez carefully as he concluded. Lizzie and I are watching for signs of anything unusual, what with his 13th birthday coming up next month. Inez rolled her eyes in exasperation as she opened her mouth to speak, when suddenly the golden ring on Earl O'Brien's right hand lit up like a fire engine. The previously dark red garnet stone was now pulsating with a brilliant light from within. All conversation in the room came to an abrupt halt as each person at the table turned their attention to Earl's hand. Apparently, Jack was about to become a much more interesting boy. And that's the end of today's episode. So Monday, I will return with another reading, and we'll start with Chapter 7, Deception, Stockholm, Sweden, 2 years prior. I hope you've enjoyed my reading today from The Golden Telescope, Book 1 in my Jack and the Magic Hat Maker series. And I hope you have an awesome weekend. Do something fun. And before you go, please do take a moment to subscribe to my channel and to ring that bell so that you receive notifications every time I upload new content and have more of my stories to share with you. Take good care. This is Tracy Partridge-Johnson. I look forward to joining you again next time.